Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Focaccia di Recco. That's right, I checkoed myself before I de-reccoed myself, and I'm so glad I did because this came out amazing. Especially since this is the first time I've ever attempted this delicious and super fun to make Ligurian flatbread. This is actually a personal food wish of mine, which might sound a little selfish, but after you see what we do here, I think you're going to forgive me. So let's get started. Step one is a very, very primitive dough. So in my mixing bowl, I'm going to add some all-purpose flour, a little bit of salt, a little bit of olive oil, and some cold water. And I'm going to go ahead and use the dough hook attachment on our stand mixer. And we're going to need that until it's very soft and elastic, but not sticky. All right, so don't be afraid to start out a little too sticky and add a little more flour as you go to get this perfect texture. And yes, you can absolutely do this by hand. I was just feeling a little lazy. But anyway, like I said, we're looking for a very soft, elastic, but not too sticky dough. So you're going to want something that looks and feels just about like that. And by the way, I feel sorry for people that don't cook for lots of reasons, but that they don't ever get to feel something like this is one of the big ones. I mean, seriously, everybody needs to feel that at least once in their life. And ideally hundreds, if not thousands of times, okay? But anyway, once our dough ball is formed, we're going to wrap that in plastic wrap, and we're just going to let it sit on the countertop at room temperature for 1 hour. It has to rest, it has to relax, and I'm assuming that flour has to hydrate a little bit for this dough to really work well. All right, so our dough's resting, which is going to give us time to prep our half sheet pan. That's right, that is officially called a quarter sheet pan. Very easy to find at any restaurant supply store or online, and it really is one of the secrets to this recipe. You can do this in other pans, and I'll explain that on the blog post, but this is the perfect pan. And to prep that, we're going to very, very lightly grease it with some olive oil, and then a very light sprinkling of cornmeal. All right, so our pan's prepped. At this point, our dough has rested 1 hour. We're going to unwrap it. I'm going to give it a little dusting of flour, and I'm going to divide it in half. All right, so this recipe is going to make 2 focaccia di Reccos, and then I'll cut that half in half, and we're going to take one of those quarters, and we'll pat that out a little bit, flatten it out a little bit. As usual, we're only using enough flour to work with, and we are going to do most of the work with our hands, but what we want to do to start this is take a rolling pin and just kind of start it into the shape of a rectangle. Certainly does not have to be anything exact, but something like that. I guess that's more of an oval than a rectangle, but you get the idea. And once that's happened, we're going to pick that up with some very well floured hands, and we're going to start stretching it. And note to self, next time you do focaccia di Recco, wear a long sleeve shirt. But anyway, just pick it up and kind of stretch it over the back of your hands. And if you keep going around like that, the weight of the dough will kind of stretch itself. And as long as you've trimmed those fingernails, you should be okay. And what we want to do is stretch it out until it's large enough to fit over that edge of the pan. And as soon as you think you got it big enough, kind of stretch it over like that, and then simply work it and stretch it over the entire pan. And what we're looking for is a very, very thin, almost membrane of dough. And if you get a little hole, just patch it up and keep stretching. You can do this. And like I said at the beginning, this is the first time I tried this, so I'm assuming with practice this gets a lot easier. And once our bottom layer of dough is done, we're going to go ahead and we're going to place in our cheese. Now, traditionally, Stracchino cheese is used, but around these parts, what we get is called Crescenza, and it's very, very similar, very, very delicious. And I'm going to put 6 nice dollops in there, which is about half the amount of cheese that the restaurant that inspired me to do this uses. They use about twice as much, but I think because this was my first attempt, I wanted to go a little less with the cheese, but I promise I will use more next time. And then once we've placed in our cheese, we're going to do the exact same procedure with the top layer of dough. We're going to roll it out to a rectangle. We're going to stretch it over our hands until it's big enough to stretch over the top. We'll stretch it over the first 2 corners. And once you got one end stretched over, just go around and stretch out the rest. So keep stretching, keep pulling, keep sealing. And you'll notice once it's sealed, you have air trapped in there. That's exactly what you want. You want that top piece of dough stretched thin like a membrane, just like the bottom. You know what? That kind of reminds me of something I saw on a German website one time. Anyway, once that's stretched over and you've gone around and sealed the 2 pieces of dough together, simply take your rolling pin and go along the edge, cutting off the excess dough, and then just take your thumb and kind of roll down the edges like this, and those 2 layers should be sealed. And to make sure, you can always do a little folding over, a little pressing with the fingertips. But be careful, you do not want a thick crust of dough. This is not pizza dough. So it really needs to be ultra thin to work. So you do not want a bunch of excess dough wadded up around the edges. But that looks good right there. And then for by far my favorite part of the operation, the old pinch, pull, and tear. So take your fingers like this, and we're just going to tear 2 or 3 small holes. I don't know why I found this so enjoyable, but I did. And at this point, it's not going to be a bad idea to preheat your oven to 500. This is going to get cooked in a very, very hot oven. So preheat your oven. And then the last couple steps here, while we're waiting for our oven to get hot, we're going to drizzle over a little more olive oil. And we're also going to give it a little sprinkling of coarse sea salt. And that is ready for the oven. We're going to go ahead and pop that in the center of a 500-degree oven for about 6 or 7 minutes or until it looks like this. The top's going to be browned and crusty, and don't be surprised if it puffs up in the oven. It will. And even though I was risking serious burns, I couldn't help myself. I had to do this for a few seconds. Totally worth it. And yes, a tiny bit of cheese did leak out, but that's fine. That happens in the restaurant I stole this from. I just used my spatula to push that melted cheese under the crust so nobody knew. It'll be our secret. So we're going to transfer that onto a plate or platter. We'll go ahead and cut that in quarters, and then you're certainly free to enjoy as is. But for me, it's best with a nice handful of arugula that you toss in a little bit of olive oil, and I'll put a little bit of greens on there, and I'll kind of fold it up, New York City style. And you have a beautiful contrast between the two layers. The top is kind of crispy and blistered and caramelized, and then the layer underneath kind of gets soaked with that melty cheese. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful combination. Anyway, good job, Italians, in particular Ligurians. Like I said, this was my own personal food wish that I granted to myself. Yes, that is legal. And I really do think you're going to like this as much, if not more than I did. So I do hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.